The morning arrived the way difficult things often do in Ohio. Without announcement, without the courtesy of warning, a low sky pressed itself over Millhaven like a judgment already reached the kind of gray that does not threaten rain, so much as it simply refuses to lift, as though the atmosphere has made a decision about the day and will not be argued with. The maple trees along the square had given up their leaves weeks earlier, and what remained of October stood stripped and bare and entirely honest about itself. No decoration, no softening, just the bare shape of things after everything unnecessary had fallen away. Margaret Holt had been living inside that kind of honesty for some time now, though she had not always had a name for it. She sat at the kitchen table of the apartment on Granby Street, with her second cup of coffee and a folder she had retrieved from the back bedroom closet that morning. A manila folder she had not opened in 2 years, and she was looking at it without yet opening it again. Outside the window, the parking structure that constituted her view presented its concrete face to the November morning with the same indifference it presented every morning. It had been 8 months since they'd moved here. She had stopped expecting the view to improve. Margaret Holt was 74 years old. She had been born in Millhaven in the house on Caldwell Street that her parents had rented and eventually bought, and that she had passed every day of her childhood on the walk to school. She had married Walter Holt in the First Methodist Church at the end of that same street when she was 22, and he was 24 in June of 1971, in a ceremony her mother had organized with the meticulous care of a woman who understood that a wedding was a community event as much as a personal one. She had raised 3 children in this town. She had built a business here. She had taught Sunday school for 20 years at Millhaven Community Church and served on the food pantry committee and the building committee, and showed up for every workday and fundraiser with the steady, unremarkable reliability of someone who understood that institutions required maintenance, and maintenance required people who did not have to be asked twice. For 40 years, Holt's Hardware had occupied the corner of Main and Caldwell. The store had started as a single room behind a borrowed storefront in the spring of 1984, when their youngest Willow was still in diapers and Nora was in second grade, and Everett was somewhere in between at the age of childhood, where everything is a referendum on fairness. Walter had been the face of the place, and that part had been genuine and valuable. He was tall and broad-shouldered and possessed of an easy warmth that made people feel welcomed before they had finished coming through the door. He remembered faces and names and the specific projects people were working on, and he had a gift for talking to a customer about a problem in a way that made the problem feel manageable. But Margaret had run it. This was not a secret in any formal sense. Anyone who paid attention would have known it. The inventory system was Margaret's. The accounts were hers. The decisions about what to stock and what to discontinue, which suppliers to trust, and which ones were padding their numbers, who to extend credit to, and when to hold the line, those were all Margaret's decisions arrived at through the kind of mind that moves in straight lines toward practical solutions and does not require the approval of the room before it acts. She had done this work for 40 years without needing anyone to notice. That she understood now had been her first error. Not the work itself, which had been necessary and good, but the assumption that work done quietly and consistently would eventually announce itself, that the accumulation of 40 years would constitute a record that the town would hold and honor when the arithmetic finally turned against her. The arithmetic turned against them in 2018 when HomeMax opened on Route 9 with its warehouse pricing and its parking lot the size of 4 city blocks and its corporate signage visible from the highway in both directions. Margaret had been watching for it for 2 years before it arrived. She had gone to 3 regional hardware association meetings and listened to the progression described by people who had already lived it. She had come home and spread the numbers on the kitchen table and tried to explain to Walter what the numbers were saying. Walter had said Millhaven people were loyal, that 40 years meant something. Margaret had looked at him across the table with the patience of a woman who had been right about numbers for a long time and said that loyalty was a feeling and numbers were facts, and when those two things came into direct conflict, facts did not yield out of sentiment. She had been right. Being right had not helped either of them. The decline moved at first like something gradual, and then like something that had always been moving faster than it appeared. Foot traffic down 10%, then 15%, then a quarter of the reliable accounts going quiet without cancellation or a complaint, the natural drift of people following convenience without looking back. Margaret restructured the inventory twice. She pushed harder on the specialized services, the custom orders, the kind of problem solving that a national chain's hourly employees could not and would not provide. It helped. It was not enough. By 2021, she was drawing on savings to cover the gap. By 2022, the debt had been restructured twice. In the early weeks of 2023, she sat at the kitchen table on Wren Street with the last version of the numbers arranged in front of her and understood with the complete unhedged clarity of someone who has been a practical person for a long time that the numbers had made their final argument and there was no further restructuring available. She sat with that understanding for 3 days before she told Walter. He had always felt things fully, which was the quality that had made him a genuinely warm person and a reliable comfort in good times and a man who needed her to carry more than her share when times were hard. She had always known this about him. She had carried what he needed her to carry across 52 years without resentment because she understood that it was simply the nature of the arrangement, the particular way their marriage was balanced, and because the carrying had never felt like burden so much as it felt like purpose. She told him the store had to close. He sat with the papers in front of him for a long time without speaking. Then he began suggesting alternatives she had already considered and eliminated. She answered each one with the facts. He went quiet. He looked at his hands. He said nothing else that evening, and the nothing said more than anything he could have articulated. They closed Holt's Hardware in October of 2023. Margaret managed the closing the way she had managed everything for 40 years, with precision and without waste. She paid what could be paid, negotiated what needed negotiation, handled the paperwork with the same meticulous accuracy she had brought to 4 decades of accounts. The building was sold to cover the outstanding obligations. The inventory was liquidated. The bell above the door that had rung for 40 years when a customer came in was gone in 6 weeks. Margaret did not cry when the building sold. She had finished that grief privately during the 3 days between understanding the numbers and telling Walter, and by the time the closing became a public fact, she had already moved through the worst of it into something quieter. She had not anticipated Dalton Pruitt. Dalton Pruitt was 43 years old. In 2001, when he was 20, Margaret had convinced Walter to extend him a line of account credit so he could purchase materials for the first renovation project his newly started contracting business had taken on. He had come to the counter, nervous and earnest, and Margaret had looked at him and seen someone trying seriously to build something who needed a small extension of trust to get started. She had given it. He had paid his account. He had built his contracting company into a development firm and spent the next 2 decades acquiring properties in Millhaven with the focused efficiency of a man who had discovered his competence early and stayed loyal to it. 3 days after Margaret and Walter signed the sale papers, Dalton Pruitt held a press conference on the corner of Main and Caldwell. Margaret heard about it from Nora and watched the video at the kitchen table that evening. She watched Dalton Pruitt stand in front of architectural renderings of the corner of Main and Caldwell, reimagined as something glossy and contemporary, and she listened to him speak about revitalization and downtown energy in the future of Millhaven's commercial corridor. He thanked the city council. He thanked his investors. He thanked his team. He did not say the word Holt. He did not mention the 40 years. She closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall of the apartment, which was bare because they had not hung anything yet, and she understood something about Dalton Pruitt that she had not fully understood before. He had not omitted the name Holt out of deliberate cruelty. He had omitted it because from where he stood there was nothing to mention. The building had been available. He had acquired it. The corner had a future. He was that future. The previous occupant was neither an obstacle nor a character in the story he was telling. She was simply a line in a transaction that had been completed. This understanding was not comforting, but it was clarifying in a way that anger would not have been. Walter took work at Home Max because the savings after the debts were covered would last 14 months at their current expenses, and they needed income. Margaret had done this arithmetic before she told him and had the conversation ready when he needed to have it. He drove to Home Max and filled out the application and came home with the blue vest folded under his arm and a quality in his face she had not seen there before, a specific diminishment that was different from sadness, more like the look of a man who has discovered that the world holds a revised assessment of him and the revision is significantly lower than the original. She took the job at the library reshelving books. She was good at it. She had always been good at tasks that required organization and precision and a willingness to do accurate work without requiring the work to be glamorous. She was not good at being invisible in a place she had spent 40 years being known, but she had managed more difficult things than that. The library was where she heard what she needed to hear. She was returning volumes to the East reference shelf on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard two women in the adjacent aisle speaking at a volume that was not quite private. She did not intend to listen, but she heard her name before she had made the decision to stop, and she stopped. The conversation was not exceptional in its cruelty. Loss at 74 interpreted as evidence of flawed judgment, speculation about their children's unwillingness to help. A final assessment delivered in the confident tone of a woman who has already decided and is now simply reciting, "You reap what you sow." What Margaret stood with for a long time afterward was not the words. It was the sound the second woman made. A small agreeing sound, wordless, that required no argument and no evidence and no engagement with the actual facts of 40 years. Just the sound of a town that had already reached its verdict and found the reaching cost nothing. She put the book on the shelf. She finished her shift. She drove home and made dinner and did not tell Walter what she had heard because there was nothing in the telling that would have helped either of them, and the not telling was the only form of protection she had available. What she did instead was begin to think in a different direction than she had been thinking. The church was the last thing she had believed would hold. Millhaven Community Church, where she and Walter had attended for 47 years, where she had taught Sunday school for 2 decades, and served on every committee that needed serving, and given steadily of both time and money through all the years when they had money to give. It was the one institution in Millhaven she had trusted completely and without audit, trusted in the way that you trust something whose purpose you believe in rather than whose performance you have evaluated. Pastor Glenn Marsh had led the church for 12 years. He was capable and organized and possessed of the particular pastoral skill of making people who were doing well feel that their doing well was connected to their character. The congregation had grown under his leadership, supported by the professional class that had discovered in Millhaven Community Church a congregation whose aesthetics and comfort level matched their own. The building had been renovated. The programs were well funded. The Sunday attendance was impressive. Margaret had understood for years what the church had become under Marsh's leadership. She had not discussed this understanding with Walter, who found genuine sustenance in it and did not require her analysis. She had not discussed it with anyone because it was the kind of clear-eyed assessment that made you sound cold, and she was not cold. She was simply accurate, which was a different thing that was sometimes mistaken for the same. On the Sunday following the library, she and Walter attended as they always had. She sat in the pew they had occupied for decades, sang the hymns, listened to the sermon, shook hands with people who greeted her with the careful warmth of people maintaining a social form that their actual feeling no longer fully supported. She recognized this quality and accepted what? Social forms exist precisely for situations where actual feeling has become inconvenient. As they gathered their coats, Pastor Glenn Marsh approached. He spoke about their pledge, about the church's appreciation for their years of faithful service, about a satellite service on Thursday evenings, less formal, a different kind of community, more suited to people in different seasons of life, people who might feel more comfortable in a setting that was less structured. Walter was nodding. Margaret watched her husband begin the apologetic posture she had seen him construct a dozen times in the past year. The slight rounding of the shoulders, the expression of a man absorbing a judgment while working to conceal the cost of the absorption. She put her hand on his arm. She picked up her coat. "Thank you, Pastor Marsh," she said. Her voice was level, not hostile, not performing anything, simply what it was. "We'll be in touch." She guided Walter toward the door. They walked to the car in the November morning without speaking. She started the engine and sat with her hands on the wheel. "Margaret," Walter said. "I know," she said. "We don't have to, well, we do," she said, "and not just the church." She drove home. There are moments in long marriages when one person sees the whole shape of what has been built and understands with quiet, complete certainty where it has to go next. Not a dramatic moment, not the kind of thing that announces itself with appropriate gravity. More often, it arrives during something ordinary while you're driving, while you're washing dishes, while you're sitting in a parked car outside a church you just attended for the last time. It has the quality not of decision, but of recognition. The thing was already true. You are simply finally seeing it. Margaret drove home and went into the back bedroom closet and reached to the shelf above the hanging clothes and pulled down a manila folder she had not opened in 2 years. She brought it to the kitchen table. The folder contained the documentation for the property on Granger's Ridge. Walter's uncle Rudolph had left it to them in 2015. A cabin on 52 acres in the hill country of West Virginia, 4 hours southeast, accessible by paved county road and then by a dirt track through old-growth timber. The cabin had been built by Rudolph himself, who had spent 30 years as a land surveyor and had strong opinions about structural integrity and equally strong preferences for solitude. The property had been in the family since the 1940s. Margaret had filed it in 2015 with the thought that they might sell it when the market was favorable. The market had not been favorable. The property taxes had been manageable. The folder had sat on the shelf for 8 years. She read through the documentation with the same attention she had brought to 40 years of business records, survey maps, tax history, a description that used the word rustic 3 times, which she understood as the legal and real estate community's way of saying that a structure was present, but comfort was not guaranteed. She was sitting with the folder open when she heard Walter's key in the lock. He came in and saw her at the table and stopped in the kitchen doorway. She had been married to this man for 52 years. She knew the precise geography of his face, knew where tension lived and where it released, knew the specific way his expression moved when he was afraid, and the different way when he was uncertain and waiting for her to indicate the direction. He was uncertain now. Waiting. "Sit down, Walter," she said. He sat. She put her hand flat on the folder. "We have a cabin. Maggie." His voice was careful in the way of a man who has heard this folder discussed before and formed an opinion. "We've been through this. The cabin hasn't been touched in years. We're in our 70s. West Virginia winters at elevation." "I know what the winters are," she said. "I've read the documentation." She looked at him steadily. "And I know what the winters are here." He was quiet. "Here," she said, "we are disappearing into someone else's story about us. We are becoming the cautionary tale that people tell at church socials and over coffee, and every day we stay, we confirm it. We become smaller by degree until there's nothing left that either of us recognizes as what we actually are." Walter looked at the table. "The church today," she said. "That was the last piece of information I needed. I'm not angry, I'm not surprised, but I'm not going to sit in a Thursday satellite service for people who are struggling while Dalton Pruitt holds press conference in front of the building we built with 40 years of our lives." She pulled the survey map from the folder and spread it between them. "We have a cabin. It needs work. The winters will be hard. We are not young. All of that is true, and none of it changes what I know." "What do you know?" Walter asked. His voice was quiet, not defeated. She could hear him listening. "I know we have been steady and decent for 50 years, and I know that steadiness and decency are not protection against what has happened to us here. And I know that staying in this town because it is familiar is not the same as staying because it is good for us." She looked at the map. "Millhaven has decided we are finished. I am not willing to accept that verdict." Walter studied the survey map for a long time. "The roof description," he said slowly, "sagging on the south side. That was the 2015 filing, 8 years ago. The pump, hand pump spring-fed. If the spring is still running, it should function." He looked at her across the table at his wife of 52 years, at the woman who had sat across from him at this same table and laid out the store's numbers 2 years before the store closed. Who had been right then and had been right about most things across the long arc of their life together, in the specific, unshowy way of someone who simply looks at what is in front of them without negotiation. "You've already decided," he said. She looked back at him. "I decided in the parking lot of the church. I'm telling you now because I want you to come with me." He looked at his hands on the table, the hands of a 76-year-old man who had done physical work for most of those years, large and capable, and marked by decades of use. He looked out the window at the parking structure. He looked back at the map. "We'd need to be careful," he said. "We'll be careful. We don't know the condition. We'll find out when we get there. The children, we'll tell them," she said. "After." That last word settled between them with its own weight. After. after the decision was made and acted on and the truck was pointed southeast. Because if they told the children before there would be calls, there would be concern delivered in the language of practicality that was also the language of doubt. There would be underneath all of the genuine care the additional weight of children who had been made uncomfortable by their parents' difficulty and were not eager for the discomfort to continue in a more dramatic form. Margaret was not angry at her children. She understood why Nora and Everett and Willa had kept the careful distance they had kept across the past 2 years. They had their own lives, their own pressures, their own methods of managing the discomfort of watching parents age inside difficulty. She did not require apology for it. She simply could not afford to give their doubt the opportunity to work on a decision she had already made and knew to be right. Walter looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he said, "I can have the tools loaded by Thursday." Margaret folded the survey map back into the folder. "I was thinking Tuesday." The days between that conversation and Tuesday were not dramatic. Margaret did not compose farewell letters or make rounds of goodbyes. She sorted through the apartment with the same efficiency she had brought to the store closing, packing what mattered, releasing what didn't, working on the principle she had always worked on, which was that most possessions are more portable than they feel, and most attachments more voluntary than they appear. She left a note in the keys for the landlord. She sent a text to all 3 children on Sunday evening. "We've moved. We're fine. We need some time. We'll be in touch when we're settled." Nora called back within 20 minutes. Margaret looked at the phone and let it ring. She would call Nora back when they were 4 hours southeast and the fact of their new location was established, rather than debatable. She went to bed at 10. She lay in the dark beside Walter, who was sleeping with the complete surrendered sleep of a man who has been given a direction to move in after weeks of directionless uncertainty. She listened to his breathing and to the ambient sounds of the building around them, the television from the upstairs unit, the late traffic outside the particular urban quiet of a building full of people who do not know each other's names. She had lived here 8 months. She had kept the space clean and paid the rent and been a responsible tenant. She would not miss it. She lay in the dark and thought about Millhaven. The way you think about a place you are leaving for the last time, not with bitterness, not precisely with grief, but with the complex and honest attention of someone who wants to see a thing clearly before it is no longer available to be seen. She thought about 40 years of early mornings in the store, the key in the lock, the lights coming in, the bell above the door ready for the first customer of the day. She thought about every name she had known and every account she had carried and every small decision across 4 decades that had added up to a life in this particular place with these particular people. She thought about the sound the woman in the library had made. She did not feel rage lying in the dark of the Granby Street apartment. She did not feel sorrow in the way sorrow requires the thing lost to have been worth keeping. What she felt was the specific clarity of a person who has received the last piece of information a situation required and now knows with complete certainty what to do with it. The picture was whole. She had looked at it fully. She knew what it meant. She got up at 3:30. She dressed in the dark, made coffee, drank it standing at the bare kitchen counter, looking at the apartment in its stripped state walls. Empty surfaces cleared the space, reduced to its essential dimensions. Then she set the cup in the box she was taking, picked up her keys, and went to wake Walter. He came awake the way he had always come awake, immediately, completely without fumbling. He reached for his boots. She appreciated this about him still. They loaded the last boxes in 3 trips, their breath visible in the November cold, the street empty and yellow under the sodium lights. Margaret closed the tailgate and stood for a moment looking at the building, at the parking structure, at the street she had driven every day for 8 months. She had given this town everything it asked for. She got in the truck. She started the engine. Walter was in the passenger seat with his jacket collar turned up, his large hands on his knees facing forward. She could feel him ready. She pulled onto Granby Street and drove east toward Route 33. At the corner of Main and Caldwell, she passed the chain-link fencing around the building where Holt's Hardware had stood. Construction barriers were up. A project sign displayed the architectural rendering and the development firm's name in large, confident letters. In the pre-dawn dark, the building behind the fencing was just a shape dark and ordinary. Nothing in it to tell you what had stood there or for how long or what it had cost the people who had built it. Margaret drove past without slowing. She did not check the rearview mirror. The highway opened ahead of them, straight and empty and gray in the dark before dawn, and she accelerated, and the truck moved through the sleeping town and out the other side, and then the town was behind them, and the fields were on both sides, and the sky above the eastern horizon was beginning barely to suggest the shape of what would eventually become light. Walter was asleep before they reached the county line. Margaret drove. She drove through the Ohio hills and across the state line and into West Virginia, where the land began to rise and the highway narrowed, and the world outside the windshield became something older and less managed and more itself. She drove through darkness and into a gray dawn, and through the dawn into a morning that came on cold and specific and clear of the sky, the particular pale blue of November at elevation, the bare trees standing in the gray-brown hills, with the dignity of things that have been exactly what they are for a long time. She drove without the radio, without conversation, without the need for either. She was not afraid. This surprised her when she noticed it. She had expected to be afraid and had made room for it in her accounting, had understood that fear was the reasonable response to two people in their mid-70s choosing to live off-grid in the West Virginia mountains in November. But the fear had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something she recognized from 1984, from the morning she had walked through the door of the first storefront space with the inventory she had spent 3 months sourcing and the account system she had built from scratch in the complete absence of any guarantee that any of it would work. That feeling, the feeling of moving towards something uncertain with the particular confidence of a person who has done the honest work of preparation. She had been 34 the first time she had felt it. She was 74 now. The road climbed into the timber country. She followed the memorized directions from the survey documentation to the county highway, to the state road, to the gravel track, to the dirt track marked at the turn by a mailbox post that had lost its mailbox years ago and now served only as a landmark for people who knew to look. She turned in. The truck moved through old-growth timber, slow over the ruts and the exposed roots and the places where the track had washed out and been filled in approximately. The trees on both sides were massive and dark and indifferent, the canopy bare, but the trunks close enough that the light came through at angles, the track moving through them, like something that had been allowed rather than cleared. Walter woke when the ground got rough. He looked at the trees and then at the track. "Close," he said. "Almost," she said. The track curved and the trees opened and the clearing appeared. The cabin sat at the far end of it. Margaret stopped the truck and looked at it through the windshield. It was smaller than she had pictured, though she had tried to picture it accurately from the documentation. 80 years old at least, the timber dark with age and weather, the logs fitted together with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years understanding how things needed to hold. The south side of the roof sagged visibly enough to be a project, but not enough to suggest structural failure. One porch step was split at the center. The hand pump stood beside the door like something waiting to demonstrate its usefulness. The windows were intact but opaque with accumulated years. The stone chimney at the east end rose straight and appeared sound, exactly as rustic as advertised. Walter looked at the cabin for a long time. Then he said in the careful voice of a man saying a thing he has been deciding whether to say, "It's not much, Maggie." Margaret looked at the dark timber in the stone chimney and the hand pump in the clearing and the West Virginia sky above all of it, pale and cold and indifferent and absolutely honest about what it was. "No," she said, "it's not." She opened the door and got out. The air was immediate cold clean, carrying the smell of pine resin and cold earth, and the specific sharpness of mountain air that has not been processed by anything between the ridge and her lungs. She stood beside the truck and breathed it. Then she walked toward the door across the clearing, through the dry leaves toward whatever was on the other side of it. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The lock engaged with a sound so definitive in the cold air that both of them went still for a moment. She pushed the door open and stepped through. The interior was a single room, designed by a man who understood that in a space heated by hand, utility and waste cannot coexist. A cast-iron pot-bellied stove occupied the northeast corner, oxidized but structurally intact. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center under a film of gray dust. A sleeping area along the west wall was separated from the main space by a curtain rod that still held its curtain-faded cotton that had been blue once and was now the color of old skis. The kitchen end held a deep sink wooden counter, scarred with U-shelves built into the wall, with the squared precision of a man who understood the difference between a shelf that would hold and one that merely appeared to. Mouse evidence on every surface. A bird's nest in the northeast corner near the chimney. The south wall showed the water damage from the sagging roof, a dark stain running from eave to floor, where moisture had found its way through across multiple seasons. Walter came in and stood in the center and turned slowly, doing the assessment. Margaret was already at the stove. She opened the firebox and checked the interior with her flashlight. Sound. Old cold ash. The flue damper moved when she worked it, stiff but functional. She closed the firebox and went to the pump and worked the handle. It resisted with the grudging resistance of disused metal, and she pumped steadily for 30 seconds before the sound came from below, the deep subterranean pull of water being drawn up through old pipe from the spring. Rudolph Holt had drilled in 1962, which had apparently been doing its job in the decades since without anyone's knowledge or appreciation. Brown water first, then clearing, then cold and clean, running over her hand with the complete indifference of something that has been functional all along and is mildly surprised to find itself being used. She turned to Walter. "Pump works," she said. He was looking at the water stain on the south wall. "Roof needs attention," he said. "Yes." "Before snow?" "Yes." He looked at her. Something had shifted in his expression during the 30 seconds it had taken the pump to produce water. The inventory was complete, and the inventory said damaged but not destroyed, which was the precise difference between despair and work, and Walter Holt had always been better at work than at despair. "There was tin roofing in the shed," he said. "I saw it," Margaret said. "Get the broom from the truck." That was how it began, not with a speech, not with a decided moment, just the pump producing water and the broom located, and the two of them moving through the cabin with the practical efficiency of people who have been alongside each other long enough to communicate the essential things without language. The first 3 days were work in the purest sense. Margaret scrubbed while Walter cleared debris. She found steel wool and blocked every gap at floor level with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that problems left unaddressed compound. She cleared the flue with a length of chain from the shed. Walter worked the roof with tin sheeting and roofing nails, his back giving him trouble on the ladder, but his hands steadied the determination of a man who understands that the choice is not between pain and comfort, but between the pain of the work and the worst pain of the water damage continuing through a winter. On the third evening, they tested the stove. Margaret built the first fire, carefully dry wood kindling, first larger pieces added gradually, the damper adjusted until the draw was right. The smoke went up the chimney, and the heat came into the room, and the cast iron ticked and expanded, and the cold that had occupied the cabin for 8 years began with grudging, then increasing conviction to withdraw. They ate soup heated on the stove's flat surface. They sat at the table in the orange light of the fire, with the West Virginia night pressing close and complete outside, no street lights, no traffic, no ambient noise from other people's lives seeping through walls too thin to keep it out. Walter said, "We did it." Margaret looked at the fire. "We did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "First night in a house that's actually ours." She knew what he meant. The apartment on Granby Street had never been theirs in this sense. They had rented it because they needed somewhere to sleep, and they had slept there, and that had been the full extent of the relationship. This was different. Every clean surface was clean because she had cleaned about it. Every sealed gap was sealed because she had found the bomb and addressed it. The fire was burning because she had built it. The warmth in the room traced back through each specific act to the two people sitting in front of it and to no one else. She had not felt this since the earliest years of the store. She had forgotten what it was to inhabit a result that was entirely your own production. Millhaven sent its first communication on Wednesday morning, 4 days after the departure, in the form of a phone call from Nora. Margaret answered this time. She sat on the porch in her coat with the phone against her ear and listened to her oldest child move through the predictable stages. Genuine concern, then relief that her parents were physically unharmed. Then a more careful concern that was really doubt wearing the clothes of care. Nora said, "A cabin in West Virginia, Mom. At your ages, in November." Margaret said, "The stove draws well and the pump gives good water." Nora said, "That's not really the point. Margaret looked at the clearing, at the bare trees in the pale morning, at the frost on the dead grass that the low sun was just beginning to address. She said, "Nora, we made a decision. It was ours to make. I'm calling to tell you we're fine." There was a silence that contained several things: genuine concern, genuine irritation, and underneath both the faint, persistent note she had heard in her daughter's voice across many calls in the past 2 years, the sound of a child who had been made uncomfortable by her parents' situation and had not fully resolved whether the discomfort was theirs to own or hers. Margaret did not address this. She gave Nora the coordinates, since the property had no street address, told her they would be in touch when the routine was established, and ended the call with the level courtesy she had used in the church parking lot and at the Home Max loading dock, and in every situation in the past year where someone had communicated in language careful enough to be deniable that she and Walter had become inconvenient. She put the phone away and went in to start breakfast. The days organized themselves. Within 2 weeks of arrival, the shape of their life on the ridge had assembled itself not through planning, but through the recovery of something that had always been there and had been obscured. They rose with the light, which arrived late and gray and gradual at this latitude and elevation in November. Margaret started the fire and the coffee. Walter walked the property, checking the perimeter and the shed and the well housing, making the small daily assessments a working property requires of its occupants. They ate breakfast together at the table in the unhurried way they had eaten breakfast in the early years of their marriage, before the store had absorbed so much of their attention that most conversation had become operational, the daily logistics of a business and a family running simultaneously in the same house. Here the conversation was different. It ranged over the property, over what needed doing and in what order, over the books they had packed and were reading in the evenings by the oil lamp Margaret had found in the shed, and over memories, the kind that surface when you are no longer inside the thing you are remembering, clear and complete, because the noise of the present is no longer competing with them. Walter told her things he had carried through the years of the store without finding the right quiet to put down. The day in 1991 when the building inspector flagged the electrical work and Walter had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before coming home. The customer in 2003 who had accused him falsely of selling defective pipe, and the way the accusation had trailed him for months after it was resolved. Small things, the accumulated interior account of experiences she had been present for, but had not known he was experiencing in that particular way. She listened without interrupting. She had always been the better listener between them, which was one of the things Millhaven had never understood about the Holts, because it was Margaret's nature to be present without performing presence, to hear things without making the hearing visible. Walter was the one who made people feel heard, who had the gift of the warm response in the follow-up question. But Margaret was the one who actually heard. The distinction had not mattered much in the store. Here in the evenings with the oil lamp and the fire and nothing competing for either of their attentions, it mattered enormously. They were, she came to understand, becoming reacquainted. Not in the way of people who have grown apart and are struggling to close the distance, but in the quieter way of two people who have been standing so close to the same demanding thing for so long that they could not see each other clearly, and who find when they step back from it that what they are looking at is someone they deeply and specifically recognize. November became December. The cold deepened in the mountain way, not the wet, heavy cold of the Ohio Valley, but something drier and more fundamental, the cold of a place where temperature drops at night into ranges that require you to take them seriously. Margaret read everything in the small shelf Rudolph had left behind, which included a 1978 field guide to mountain survival, a homesteading manual from the 1960s, and a collection of Appalachian herbal remedies assembled by a woman whose name was illegible in the faded inscription, but whose knowledge was comprehensive and specific. She read the herbal manual with the same attention she had brought to the store's accounts, not for interest, as a working document. She cataloged what was available in the surrounding terrain against the seasons, made notes, cross-referenced against the field guide, organized what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to know. She did all of this before she needed any of it. This preparation would matter more than she could have predicted. January arrived with 3 days of snow and nights that dropped into ranges that kept them both close to the stove after dark. They were prepared. The wood was stacked. The food supply was adequate. They had made 2 runs to the county seat in December for provisions buying with the efficiency of people who know exactly what they need because they have thought about it carefully. They were comfortable in the sense that comfort means something different on a mountain in January than in a suburban apartment. Not luxurious, but warm and fed, and inside walls they had repaired with their own hands, and together in the way they had been together for 52 years, which was its own category of warmth, entirely independent of the temperature outside. It was in the second week of February that Walter got sick. It arrived the way serious illness in older people sometimes arrives, not dramatically, but by accumulation. A cough on Monday that was worse on Tuesday. A fatigue Margaret noticed before Walter acknowledged it, the specific slowness of a man whose body is reassigning its resources. A low fever Wednesday evening that had climbed by Thursday morning into a range that made her hand pressed to his forehead go still. She checked the thermometer, 102.4. She looked at the thermometer, then she looked out the window. The road off Granger's Ridge was under 18 inches of snow. There was no reason for the county to plow a dirt access track to a single private residence in the middle of February. There was no reason, and they had not. She checked her phone and saw the signal she had managed with, since they arrived to one bar on good days, nothing reliable in the creek bottom. 18 miles to the nearest medical facility on the other side of a road under 18 inches of snow. She looked at Walter. He was on the cot behind the curtain, the heavy quilt pulled up, his breathing audible across the room. Not alarming, not yet, but carrying the quality she had heard before from her father in his last winter. The sound of breathing that is working harder than breathing should have to work. She did not panic. She went to the shelf where she had organized the herbal manual and her notes and pulled them down and carried them to the table and sat in front of them with the oil lamp turned up and read with the concentrated focus of a person working a problem that has a solution if the work is done correctly and no solution if it is not. Pneumonia in its early stages was not beyond what she had available. The manual was specific: pine needle tea for vitamin C and respiratory support, mullein, which she had dried and stored in October after identifying it on the south slope, steam treatments, positioning, hydration, temperature management, the careful balance between reducing a fever enough to be safe and allowing it to do the immune work it was doing. She knew she was not a doctor. She also knew she was here, and a doctor was 18 miles away on the other side of an unplowed road. And the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical capability was exactly the difference between the situation she was in and the situation she was not. She acted on what she had. The pine needles she had collected in December and dried in the shed were in a paper bag on the lowest shelf. She made the first tea and brought it to Walter with the matter-of-fact calm of a woman who had decided that a crisis is treated exactly like any other problem that requires you to be useful. You assess what you have, you determine what needs doing, and you do it. He looked at the cup and then at her face. He was not well enough to manage his expression. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough that you're going to drink this without argument?" Margaret. "Walter." She sat on the edge of the cot. "I have what I need. I know what to do. You're going to trust me to do it." He looked at her the way a man looks at his wife of 52 years, when he knows she is managing her own fear rather than its absence, and who has been married long enough to understand that the management is itself a form of love, and that trust is the appropriate response to it. He drank the tea. 11 days. The fever climbed on the third day to 103.8. Margaret sat beside the cot for 36 hours, without sleeping more than an hour at a stretch, waking to check the temperature, and the breathing replaced the cool cloth on his forehead, maintained the fire at the precise level the manual specified. She made the tea every 4 hours. She boiled water on the stove and held the steam over Walter's face with a towel tent. She monitored his fluid intake with the precision she had brought to 40 years of accounts. On the fourth night, he became delirious. She sat beside him and held his hand and listened to him talk in the way of a person whose fever has loosened the narrative of consciousness. He talked to people who were not in the room. His mother, 20 years dead, a customer named Birkins, whose family had moved away in the 1990s. He described the sign above the door of Holt's Hardware, its lettering, its color, the way it caught the afternoon light when the sun came around the corner of the building. Margaret held his hand and did not say anything. She was hearing for the first time the full, unmanaged weight of what the store's loss had cost him. the pure version stripped by fever of the protective layer he had maintained for her benefit across the months of the closing and the apartment and the home Max vest folded under his arm. She had known the loss was large. She had not known until now exactly how large had not been allowed to know, because Walter had been carrying it quietly so that she would not have to carry it for him. She held his hand tighter. On the ninth day, the fever broke. She knew it before the thermometer confirmed. It knew it from the quality of his breathing, which had changed in the night from the labored, monitored sound to something slower and deeper. The breathing of a body that has finished its crisis and begun the quieter work of repair. She checked the temperature at 5 in the morning, 99.1. She set the thermometer down and put her face in her hands and sat in the chair beside the cot and allowed herself privately and completely what she had not permitted herself for 11 days. Then she got up and stoked the fire and started the coffee. On the 11th day, Walter was well enough to sit up. He sat on the edge of the cot with the quilt around his shoulders and looked at Margaret across the room with an expression she had not seen in this form in 52 years of marriage, a specific combination of humility and recognition, and something that exceeded what the word gratitude could hold. "You didn't leave," he said. She kept her back to him for a moment at the stove, arranging her expression. "Where would I go?" she said. 11 days, he said. "You were here the whole time." "Yes." "You could have walked out, gone down for help." "I had what I needed here," she said. "Maggie," the voice of a man speaking from below the usual register of speech. "You saved my life." She brought him tea and sat in the chair beside the cot and looked at him. Her husband thin now from the fever, the bones of his face more present than usual, his eyes carrying the particular clarity of someone who has been close enough to the edge to have genuinely looked over it. "We've been saving each other for 50 years, she said. "This was a different kind of weather." He put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. Outside, the February ridge held its silence, the silence of a mountain that has no particular opinion about human dramas, that predates them by geological epochs and will outlast them by the same. It was not a comforting silence. It was something more valuable than comfort. It was honest. It made no claims about what you were or what you were worth or what you had failed to accomplish. It simply was, and it asked you to be what you were and nothing beyond that. In Millhaven, across the months since the Holt's departure, a different accounting was proceeding. No one was connecting its terms to the couple who had left before dawn on a Tuesday in November, because in the efficient way of small towns, the Holt's had become a filed story, a cautionary tale, and cautionary tales exist to be referenced, not interrogated. Dalton Pruitt's project on the corner of Main and Caldwell had been in trouble since January. The foundation and inspection conducted through a firm he had trusted perhaps more than the specifics warranted had missed something. The structural engineer his primary investor's legal team brought in did not miss. The remediation cost was the kind of number that changes a project from profitable to problematic, and the investor agreement contained language that allowed his partners to respond to problematic math in ways Pruitt's own attorneys had not made sufficiently clear when he signed. He was not bankrupt yet. He might not reach it. But the press conference photographs were being discussed in a different tone now. The church was losing members quietly. 3 major donors had reduced giving substantially, citing the same thing in different language: the feeling that the congregation had become more interested in the appearance of prosperity than in the practice of what it was supposed to be. A 4th had simply stopped attending, and the note of inquiry Marsh sent had not received a response. When an institution loses members without explaining departure, the silence is usually the explanation. At the library, the woman hired to replace Margaret had been found logging hours she had not worked. The supervisor who had made the hire on the grounds that Margaret's slower adaptation to digital systems made her less efficient was now recommending termination of a more technologically fluent employee who was less honest and, on examination, less competent at the actual work. None of this reached Margaret on Granger's Ridge. She was not thinking about Millhaven. She was thinking about the spring and the seed catalog she had sent for, and the fence line along the north boundary, and the notebook she had started keeping at the kitchen table after Walter was asleep, filling it with what she was understanding about the ridge and about herself in a form that would hold. The recovery took 3 weeks. Walter regained strength by stages, sitting first, then standing, then moving through the cabin, then onto the porch in the strengthening March light, with his face turned toward the sun, with the specific gratitude of a man who has recently had reason to appreciate it. Margaret watched him recover with the patient attention of someone who understood that some things required witnessing rather than management. It was in early March before Walter was fully recovered, but after the worst was clearly past that she met Owen Birch. She was working on the gap in the north fence line when she heard footsteps on the trail below the property. She straightened and saw a man in his early 60s making his way up through the timber with the deliberate pace of someone who has been walking for a long time and is managing the effort without pretending it away. Lean good hiking gear, a pack suggesting several days out. He stopped when he saw her. "Didn't expect anyone out here," he said. "We live here," Margaret said. He looked at the cabin through the trees, year-round and planning on it. He introduced himself, Owen Birch, 63, retired high school history teacher from Roanoke. He had been hiking 4 days into a 2-week solo trip he had planned with deliberateness as a way of thinking through some things. He had the quality of someone who has done the work of becoming comfortable in his own company rather than someone who was naturally solitary. She invited him up for water. He came up and sat on the porch steps and drank and looked at the clearing with the appreciative eye of someone who understood what they were looking at. Walter came out and they talked the easy talk of people on a porch without agenda. Owen mentioned his wife the way a person mentions someone recently lost fully directly without managing the fullness into something more comfortable for the listener. She had died in October. 43 years of marriage. Heart failure quick, which was merciful, and also he said it the way a man says a thing he has had months to examine from all its dimensions. Not merciful because quick meant no preparation, no last conversation that knew it was the last. Walter offered genuine condolences in the way of a man who understood loss from the inside. Margaret sat on the porch and listened. She heard Owen describe the specific loneliness of grieving in a world with a narrow tolerance for grief of duration and depth. His children wanted him managing. His friends wanted him moving forward. The community around him had a timeline for his recovery that did not correspond to any timeline he could locate inside himself. "The world wants me to move on," he said. "Get over it. Start dating," as if 43 years is something you process in 6 months and close. Margaret looked at the mountains above the tree line. She thought about the library and the church and the way a community decides what it needs from a person and then loses patience when the person stops providing it. Owen's grief was inconvenient the way her poverty had been inconvenient. Not because anyone was malicious, because communities run on consensus, and consensus cannot accommodate too many persistent deviations from the established understanding of how things are supposed to proceed. She had not been failed by Millhaven because it was cruel. She had been failed by it because she had expected something from it that communities are simply not designed to provide. The expectation that 40 years of contribution would generate 40 years of loyalty. That was not how communities worked. She had believed it was because the belief had made the 40 years feel like an investment rather than an exchange. But it had always been an exchange. And exchanges have endpoints. Understanding this changed the nature of the pain from something that felt like betrayal into something more like the ache of a person who has learned something true later than was convenient and must now incorporate it. When Owen left the next morning, he said he would come back through on his return. Margaret said they would be here. She watched him disappear into the timber, then turned and looked at the cabin and the clearing and the cold spring sky above the ridge. She went inside and started the stove for dinner and began preparing what they had, which was enough. Spring arrived on the ridge the way most true things arrive, not with announcement, but incrementally in the specific and unhurried way of a world that does not operate on human timelines. The creek sound returned, first water over stone in the trees below, a low, continuous conversation Margaret had not realized she had been missing until she heard it return. Then the snow retreating from the south slope in widening patches. Then the light through the east window at a different angle, laying a stripe of pale gold across the table in the early morning. Walter noticed the light first sitting at the table one March morning with both hands around his mug, looking at it, and then at Margaret across it, and without speaking, which was his way with the things that mattered most. She said the south slope should be workable by end of month. He said, "I'll turn it when the ground gives enough." That was the whole conversation. It contained everything that needed to be said about February and the 11 days in the creek below, and the spring arriving, And the fact that they were both still here at the table with the light coming through the window at the angle that March makes possible. The garden became their shared project. Walter turned the south slope with the spade Margaret had sharpened over the winter, working the dark Appalachian soil in rows his back, carrying the consequence of February, but his hands steady the pace of a man who has learned to work within limits without being defined by them. Margaret planted with the precision she had brought to the seed catalog across the winter months. Not everything she had wanted, everything that would work. Beans and squash and potatoes and the hardy greens the elevation would support. She marked the rows with sticks and twine in the organized geometry of someone who understood that the ground's generosity required the gardener's specificity in return. During those afternoons on the slope, she became aware of something in her body she had not felt in years. Not youth, not the absence of the aches that 74 years of physical life had installed in her joints and lower back. Something underneath the aches, a quality of full presence, of being entirely in the place she was, with nothing held in reserve for the management of a gap between what was real and what needed to be presented as real. In Millhaven, even in the good years, she had carried a continuous background layer of calculation. The accounts in her mind during dinners, the awareness of quarterly numbers and supplier invoices and which accounts were at risk. The constant management of the distance between what was happening and what the store and the town and the children and the bank needed to believe was happening. The performance of equanimity for Walter, who needed her steady. The performance of competence for the customers who needed her certain. The performance of stability for the town, which needed her to be the reassuring version of herself that 40 years had established as the standard. Here the performance had no audience and no purpose. The garden needed planting, and she planted it. The fire needed wood, and Walter cut it. The stove needed banking before bed, and she banked it. The days were not complicated by the gap between what was real and what needed to appear real. They were simply days one after the other, each one complete at its end, with something accomplished that had not been accomplished at its beginning. She had not known this feeling since 1984. Owen came back through in the third week of April with more ease in his stride, some of the deliberateness replaced by something lighter. He sat on the porch and talked with the directness that 2 weeks of his own company had enabled solitude, stripping away the social management of speech. He had made decisions. He would sell his house in Roanoke. The house was a monument to a life he was no longer living, and maintaining it as though he might return to it was a form of dishonesty he could not continue. He was looking for property in the hill country, not this ridge, but this quality of place. Walter asked what had decided it. Owen was quiet a moment. "Watching you two," he said. "4 months in, and you both look like people who knew where they were. That's rarer than it sounds." Margaret heard this from the far end of the porch where she was repairing window screen and kept her attention on the work. She was hearing the outside account of something she had been living from the inside, the view from a distance of what was only visible up close when you were inside it. She found it useful in the way that outside accounts are useful not as validation, but as information. When Owen left the next morning, he said he would be in touch. She believed him. The summer was dense in the way that mountain summers are brief enough at elevation to feel like a concentrated version of itself. The garden produced. Not everything, and not in the quantities a more experienced mountain gardener might have coaxed from that ground, but enough the squash in particular requiring consultation of the homesteading manual for preservation methods she had not used since the early lean years of the marriage, when waste was genuinely something she could not afford. She canned tomatoes and dried beans and built the root cellar she had sited in the spring on the north side of the cabin, where temperatures stayed low and even through the warm months. Walter quarried flat stone from the creek bed and carried it up the slope with the methodical persistence of a man who has given himself a project and intends to see it through. Hikers came through on the trail below across the summer. Some stopped. Some who stopped came up to the clearing, drawn by the visible fact of habitation in a place where habitation was unexpected, and being glad in the way of people who have been alone for several days to talk with someone. Margaret heard stories on that porch that stayed with her. A retired engineer from Cleveland who had worked 42 years at the same company and found on his first Monday after retirement that he did not know who he was without the job and had been trying to find out since. A widow from North Carolina walking a trail alone for the first time after 30 years of walking it with her husband because she had decided the route they had loved together was still hers and that avoiding it would be a worse kind of loss. A couple in their late 50s who had sold their suburban house and were looking for land and could not yet name what they were looking for, but were trying to locate it by moving through terrain that felt more honest than what they had left. She listened to all of them. She began keeping a different kind of record in the notebook alongside the practical notes about the garden and the roof and the stove. She recorded what people said on the porch, not verbatim, but the essential shape of it, the thing underneath the specific words. She was not certain why. It felt important in the way that some things feel important before the reason is clear. Lena Cross arrived in late August in a small hatchback that managed the dirt track with more confidence than it looked capable of. She was 29, a staff writer for a regional magazine based in Charleston, covering what she described as the human geography of Appalachia, the lives of people living in the mountain country between urban corridors consistently misrepresented by both the romantic mythology and the poverty narrative competing for possession of it. She had heard about the Holts from Owen Birch, who had bought a piece of property 15 miles down the ridge in July, and mentioned them to the magazine's editor in the unstudied way that people mention things that have genuinely affected them without calculation, because the genuine effect moves the mention out before the calculation can evaluate whether to make it. Lena Cross was the kind of reporter who was genuinely curious in a way that was not professional performance. She sat at the kitchen table and asked questions with the patience to wait for real answers, rather than the social answers that most questions receive. She talked to Walter first. Walter was good with reporters for the same reason he had been good with customers. Warm, specific, present. He told the story of the store and the closing and the departure with the honesty of a man who had processed those events from enough distance to see them without being destroyed by the seeing. But she kept returning to Margaret. She asked about the decision, not the logistics which Walter had covered, but the interior of it. The thing that had happened in the parking lot of Millhaven Community Church on a November Sunday that had produced by Tuesday morning the certainty sufficient to load a truck in the dark and leave before the town woke up. Margaret thought about how to answer honestly. I understood, she said, that the town had made its determination about us. And I understood that staying to contest that determination was a form of self-diminishment I was not going to continue. Lena wrote this down. And fear, she asked, of the cabin, the isolation, what you were moving toward. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What I was afraid of, she said, was different from what you might expect. The cold, the hard work, the isolation, those are practical risks. You can assess them, prepare for them, manage them. The other thing, the becoming invisible by degrees in a place that has decided you are no longer useful, that one I could not prepare my way out of. I could only leave my way out of it. Lena wrote for a long time after the visit. The piece ran in October in the magazine's regional issue. It was, Margaret would think later, the most accurate account of something she had lived that she had ever read. Lena had not made them heroic. She had not made Millhaven villainous. She had written the truth of what had happened and what it meant with the intelligence of a writer who understood that the interesting story was not the dramatic version, but the real one. The piece was called The Woman Who Chose the Mountain. It ran with a photograph Lena had taken in the clearing, Margaret standing in front of the cabin, in the late August light, one hand on the porch rail looking not at the camera, but at something past it, with the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they recognize. Margaret did not see the piece when it ran. She had no reliable internet access on the ridge, and the magazine was not at the county store. Owen Birch brought her a copy in late October, driving up with 2 copies of the magazine and a bag of winter squash from his own first garden 15 miles down the ridge. She read it at the table after dinner, Walter reading over her shoulder in what she felt was not the satisfaction of being represented accurately, though it was that. What she felt was something she had last felt regularly in the years before Millhaven began to look through her, the experience of being seen as what she actually was, rather than as what was convenient or comfortable. The contrast between that feeling and what the past years had been was sharp enough to tell her more precisely than anything she had previously been able to articulate how much the long period of invisibility had cost. She did not know yet what the piece was doing in Millhaven. She did not know about Dalton Pruitt reading it at his attorney's office, while the bankruptcy proceedings of the Maine and Caldwell project generated their paper trail. She did not know about Pastor Glenn Marsh, who had resigned from Millhaven Community Church in June After a process that had been less about a single event than about the accumulated weight of a leadership style, the congregation had finally decided did not reflect the values the church was supposed to hold, reading the piece in the small apartment in Akron, where he was now attending a different church as a member rather than a minister, sitting with the particular discomfort of someone in the middle of a genuine reckoning. She did not know about Nora or Everett or Willa. Nora called a month after the piece ran on a Tuesday evening in November, when the second winter of the ridge was making itself felt in the temperature after dark. The call began in the way that calls between them had begun for more than a year, with the careful warmth of a relationship being maintained across a distance that was partly geography and partly something more resistant to navigation. But within a few minutes, the social layer thinned and something more essential came through. Nora said, "Mom, I've read the article 4 times." Margaret said, "Owen brought me a copy." A pause. Nora said, "The part about becoming invisible by degrees. I've been thinking about that. Because I think I watched that happen, and I told myself you needed to be more realistic. About the store, about retirement, and about accepting that some things don't work out the way you planned." Margaret waited. Nora said, "I think what I was actually doing was asking you to make yourself smaller, so I didn't have to be uncomfortable about your situation. The realism I kept offering you was really a way of saying, stop being a problem. I don't know how to explain." Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the fire in the stove and Walter reading in the chair by the window, the November ridge doing what it did outside, holding its cold and its dark with the indifference of a place that has no investment in the human dramas occurring on its surface. She said, "Nora, I know." Nora said, "You knew." She said, "I wasn't angry about it. I understood it. You had your own life to manage, and our situation was genuinely difficult to accommodate into the version of things that a person needs to maintain in order to function." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then in the voice of someone who has arrived below the prepared level of speech, "I want to come see you." Margaret said, "Come in spring. The track is difficult in winter." She said, "All three of us." Spring, and they talked for another hour after that, the kind of talk that becomes possible after the harder thing has been said, the easier things opening up in the space, the harder thing clears. It was the first fully real conversation they had had in 2 years. The first one in which neither of them was managing the gap between what was true and what was being presented as true. Everett called 3 days later. His call was shorter and more direct in the way Everett had always been direct, which had sometimes in the past meant a directness that delivered judgment in the language of practicality. This time the directness carried something else. He said, "Mom, I owe you an apology." She said, "For what specifically?" He said, "For the things I said about the store. After it closed, I said things about financial planning and timing and knowing when to stop. I framed it as practical advice. I was embarrassed and I was turning your problem into a statement about my embarrassment." Margaret looked out the dark kitchen window. She said, "Everett, you're 46 years old with your own family and your own work and your own pressures. I was not expecting you to manage ours on top of yours." He said, "That's generous." She said, "It's accurate. I'm your mother, not your responsibility, but I'll accept the apology anyway." She said, "Come in spring with your sister." He said, "We'll come." Willa called a week after Everett, which was the order. Margaret had anticipated the youngest always at her own pace, arriving at things after she had spent more time with them than her siblings needed. Willa had always been the most internally complex of the three, most likely to sit with something difficult, rather than resolving it quickly into a position. In the hard Millhaven months, she had gone quiet in the way of someone who cannot fix something and finds the unfixable too uncomfortable to witness. Willa said, "I've been thinking about what I did, which was nothing." Margaret said, "What do you mean?" She said, "When things were worst in Millhaven, I told myself you were handling it, that you always handled things, that you didn't need me to come. But what I was actually doing is not coming because I couldn't fix it and couldn't stand to see it unfixed." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about the apartment on Granby Street, the thin walls, the parking structure view, the secondhand furniture. She thought about whether she had wanted any of her children to come and found, looking at it honestly, that she had not, that she had needed to handle it in the way she needed to handle it, and witnesses would have made the handling harder rather than easier. She said, "Willa, I didn't want you to come." Willa said, "What?" She said, "I needed to handle it the way I needed to handle it, The only person whose presence was useful to me in those months was your father. And that was useful because we'd been working alongside each other for 50 years and we didn't need to perform anything for each other. What I needed from you was not your presence in Millhaven. What I needed from you was what you're doing on this call, which is being honest instead of managing the version of things you show me. Willa was quiet for a long time. Then I'm coming in spring. Margaret said yes. You are. They came in the third week of May, 3 cars making their way up the dirt track on the same Saturday morning. Nora first, then Everett, an hour behind, then Willa in the early afternoon with her husband and her teenagers. Margaret watched from the porch with her coffee. She watched Nora get out of the car and stand in the clearing and look at the cabin, and she watched the adjustment move across her daughter's face as Nora calibrated what she saw against what she had prepared herself to see. The adjustment took perhaps 15 seconds. At the end of it, Nora looked up at Margaret on the porch with an expression Margaret recognized from her daughter's childhood, the one Nora wore when something had turned out to be better than her prediction. Margaret lifted her coffee cup. Nora smiled, the genuine one, not the careful, social smile of the Millhaven phone calls. The greetings had the quality of people who have been apart long enough that the physical reality of each other, the actual height and weight and presence, is a small surprise after months of telephone distance. The teenagers arrived with the adolescent mixture of skepticism and curiosity they had prepared, which began to shift almost immediately on contact with the actual place. Willa's son found the root cellar and opened it and looked at the organized rows of preserved vegetables with an expression that moved from perfunctory interest to genuine assessment as he understood what he was looking at. "You did all this," he said to Margaret. "Your grandfather quarried the stone," she said. "I organized the interior." He looked at the root cellar and then at the cabin and then at the ridge with a different expression than he had carried when he arrived. The 2 days moved the way such visits move when the important things have already been said by phone, and what remains is the embodied version of them. Everett spent 3 hours Saturday afternoon splitting wood more than they needed for that day or the next several, working with the focus of a man who needs to do something physical because the physical activity is honest enough to justify doing it. Margaret watched him from the garden, where she was doing the evening watering, and understood this as the embodied form of what he had said on the phone, the apology made in the language of effort rather than words. She let him work. Sunday morning, she found Willa on the porch before anyone else was up. Willa had her father's quality of immediate full wakefulness, and she was sitting with her coffee in the specific stillness of a person who is thinking rather than waiting. Margaret sat beside her. They looked at the clearing in the first light of a May morning on the ridge of the pale sky above the tree line beginning to acquire the color of early light, at elevation something between gold and gray that was its own thing and not a mixture. Willa said, "You look like yourself." Margaret looked at her. She said, "I look like myself in a way you haven't seen before. That isn't the same as looking like yourself again." Willa thought about this. "What's the difference?" Margaret said. "The version of me you knew was always managing something. The store, the finances, the way things appeared to the town. I was good at that, but 50 years of management takes something from you that you don't recover by simply stopping. You have to replace it with something." She looked at the ridge. She said, "This is the replacement." When the children left Sunday afternoon, the 3 cars disappearing one by one into the timber, Margaret and Walter stood on the porch and watched until the sound of the last engine faded into the continuous sound of the ridge, the creek, the wind, the birds, the specific silence that was not absence but presence. Walter said, "Everett seemed—" He paused, searching. "Roy," Margaret looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has just heard himself say the wrong name and cannot account for it. "Everett," she said. He blinked. A long moment of the specific sheepishness of a man caught in an error he cannot argue his way out of. "That's what I said." "You said Roy." Another moment. Then with more dignity than the situation required, "Everett seemed good." "He did," she said. "He's working something out." Walter nodded and they went inside. Pastor Glenn Marsh arrived in the second week of June. Margaret was in the garden when she heard the car, a late model sedan, taking the dirt track, with the tentative caution of a vehicle whose clearance was insufficient and whose driver knew it. She stood and watched it come across the clearing and stop, and she watched the man who got out stand beside it with the posture of someone who was not certain of their welcome, and is managing the uncertainty with the visible effort of a person who has done harder things. She recognized him immediately. He had not changed substantially in the 8 months since the church parking lot. Still tall, still reflexively well-dressed, as though the habit had outlasted the occasion for it. But something in his bearing was different from the composed authority she had read across 12 years of Sunday mornings. He looked like a man who had recently had something removed that had been providing structural support and who was learning with difficulty to stand in its absence. She was not surprised he had come. She had been expecting something of this kind since the article ran not from Millhaven in general, which had moved on with the efficiency towns applied to their filed stories, but from Glen Marsh specifically. She had always understood, without articulating it, that underneath the institutional performance and the comfort-seeking congregation management was a man who had gone into ministry because he genuinely believed in something and who had allowed the demands of a successful church to move him steadily farther from that belief than he had noticed until something provided the distance necessary to see how far he had traveled. She had been that something. Not her specifically, not the act of suggesting the satellite service, which was small enough to rationalize and small enough to forget. But the fact of it made visible by the article in a way that could not be unseen once seen a pastor who had allowed institutional comfort to take precedence over institutional humanity and the people who had paid the tertium. She walked to the edge of the garden and looked at him across the clearing. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I hope I haven't come at a bad time." "Come up to the porch," she said. He came up and took the chair Walter usually occupied. Walter was in the shed. Margaret could hear the sounds of him working on the truck's tailgate through the shed wall. She did not call him in. She sat in her own chair and looked at Marsh and waited. He worked up to the beginning of what he had come to say, the way people do when they have rehearsed something and find that the presence of the actual person makes the rehearsal insufficient. She did not help him. She waited with the patience of a woman who had spent 40 years of professional life knowing when silence did better work than speech. He said, "I read the article." "I know," she said, "the part about disappearing by degrees." He looked at his hands, not the confident hands of the man who had stood in the church aisle and delivered his carefully worded suggestion about the satellite service. The hands of a man holding something he has not yet determined how to put down. "I've been thinking about that since I read it, because I think that is precisely what I asked you to do. I asked you to make yourself smaller so that the congregation could remain comfortable." "Yes," she said, "I told myself it was practical, that the church needed its donor base, that your situation was—" He stopped. "I told myself you would understand." "We did understand," she said. "We understood perfectly." He stopped again, started over from a different place. "I don't think I understood what I was doing. I think I had been doing versions of it for a long time with people whose struggle was less visible, and with you it was simply the version I finally couldn't rationalize after the fact." He looked at her directly, the directness of a man who has finished the prepared version of the thing he came to say and arrived at the actual one. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holt, for what I said in the church, for the way it communicated that your value to that congregation was contingent on your financial contribution to it." Margaret looked at Glen Marsh sitting on her porch in the June light, with the creek running below and the ridge above in its patient altitude. She said, "Glenn, the day you said what you said was the day I understood what needed to happen. If you hadn't said it, I might have stayed in Millhaven for months longer, deferring a decision I had already needed to make. You didn't harm us. You clarified things." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not angry with you. What I felt in that moment and since was clarity. Clarity is not the same thing as pain." He was quiet then. "That's more than I deserve." She said, "It's accurate. Accuracy is more useful than generosity, and it doesn't require me to manage the difference between what I feel and what I say." He stayed for coffee. Walter came in from the shed and joined them, and the three of them sat on the porch for an hour, in the ordinary way of people who have gotten past the necessary difficult thing and found that the aftermath, while not comfortable, is at least not the thing they feared. The conversation moved between the practical and the personal, as conversations on porches tend to do. Before he left, Marsh stood at the edge of the porch and looked out at the clearing. "What do you do with it?" he said. "The sense that you built something real and lost it to things that weren't fair." Margaret considered this with genuine attention. I do the work in front of me, she said. The garden, the stove, the fence line, the people who come through and sit where you're sitting now. And I find that what I thought would be a large grief has turned out to be smaller than expected, and smaller still each time I do the actual work. Not because the things that happened didn't happen, because what is happening now is more real to me than what happened then. He nodded slowly. She said, the ridge has no interest in what occurred in Millhaven. The garden has no interest. Neither does the stove. They are interested only in what I do today. After 50 years of managing the gap between what was real and what needed to appear real, that turns out to be a relief. He drove back down the track and out of sight. Walter came back from seeing him off and sat down in the chair Marsh had vacated. He said, "You were easier on him than I would have been." "I know," she said. She looked out at the clearing, at the June light in the grass and the timber beyond. She said, "He drove here instead of sending a letter. He sat in our chairs. He said the real thing instead of the managed version of it." She paused. "That deserves something. Not absolution, but something." Summer moved into fall on the ridge with the commitment of a season that does not negotiate its pace or apologize for its effect. The color started at the top of the ridge in late August and worked down through September until the whole mountain was holding fire, the specific and unrepeatable arrangement of red and orange and gold that the ridge made every year for no audience, with the thoroughness of something that does not require witness to be complete. Owen came by in September with two people he had met at the county planning meeting, a couple in their early 60s, selling their house in Columbus and looking seriously at property in the hill country. They came onto the porch and sat with the quality of people making a decision they were nearly certain of and looking not for confirmation but for an honest account from someone who had already made it. Margaret told them the honest account. She told them about the first 3 days and the February illness and the 11 days in the root cellar and the garden and the work that did not pause because the body wanted it to. She told them about what the isolation cost and what it returned. She told them about the silence of the ridge, which was not peaceful in the way people romantically imagine silence, but was honest in a way she had not found in any place she had previously lived honest, because it asked nothing from you in the way of performance or presentation, simply was what it was and required you to be what you were. The woman listened carefully. Then she said, "Is it worth it?" Margaret looked at the ridge. She said, "I can tell you what it is. Whether it's worth it for you, that's a different question and only you can answer it." "Tell me what it is then." Margaret thought about how to say it accurately. She said, "It's the first place I've lived that doesn't require me to be any size other than my actual one. Not reduced the way a community can reduce you when it decides you've stopped being useful. Not inflated to appear more certain than I am the way a business requires. Just what I am. At 74, after 50 years of being asked to be some other size, that is the most valuable thing I have ever had." The woman looked at her husband. The look between them was the look of people who have been married long enough to communicate the essential things without speaking. They bought property 12 miles down the ridge the following spring. Owen came by in October with a copy of the magazine article. He was not a sentimental man, and the visit was not sentimental. He read a passage aloud on the porch the way a person returns something to the person it belongs to. He read, "She does not describe their departure from Millhaven as escape, though the word would be accurate. She describes it as completion. The town had said what it had to say, and she had heard it and taken from it the only thing it had to offer, which was clarity. What she drove toward was not away from something, but towards something she could not have named before she found it." He closed the magazine. Margaret looked at the ridge. She said, "That's not quite right. I didn't know I was looking for anything particular. I knew I was looking for a place where I could do the work in front of me without having to manage what the world needed to think of that work." Owen considered this. "That's the same thing," he said. She thought about it. "Maybe," she said. The second winter came to Granger's Ridge with the authority of a season that has done this particular thing in this particular place for a very long time. Margaret stocked the wood in the root cellar and the shelves with the efficiency of a second-year practitioner, the uncertainty and waste of the first winter replaced by the specific competence of someone who now knows precisely what the season requires and has prepared for it to that precision and not beyond. Walter was well. stronger than he had been before February, in the way that bodies are sometimes densest and most reliable at the site of their most serious repair, the old timber laying down denser rings at the location of its deepest wounds. On the last evening of October, they sat on the porch at the threshold of the cold season. The sky held the last color of the day above the western ridge gap, the pale orange of a sunset that had been working quietly for an hour and was now in its final minutes concentrating itself into something more specific and intense than anything the full day had offered. Walter said, "Any regrets?" Margaret looked at the sky. She thought about the question with the honesty she brought to every question that deserved it, not managing her answer toward what was easiest to give or most comfortable to receive, but going to where the actual answer was and looking at what was there. She said, "I regret that it took what it took to make this choice. I regret the years in Millhaven when I knew things were wrong and managed them instead of seeing them clearly. I regret that losing everything was the price of understanding what was worth having." Walter was quiet. She said, "I don't regret a single day on this ridge. Not February, not the hard work, not any of it." She looked at him. She said, "I regret that I spent so many years fitting myself into the shape the town needed, rather than the shape I actually was. I had forgotten there was a difference until the ridge reminded me." He put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. He said, "I never knew you were doing that. I should have." She said, "I was good at not showing it. That was part of the same problem." He was quiet. The sun finished its work on the western gap, and the sky moved through the last of the color into the clear deep blue of an autumn evening on the ridge, the first stars beginning to appear above the tree line, the cold settling in with the quiet authority of a season that does not require permission. He said, "Best decision we ever made." She looked at the first stars. She said, "Second best. Marrying you was first." He squeezed her hand. They sat on the porch as the dark came on fully, and the cold descended from the upper ridge, and the creek ran below in the timber, and the stars accumulated above in their thousands. In the specific arrangement this piece of sky offered to anyone standing in this particular clearing, at this particular elevation, without the competing light of a town to diminish them. Margaret sat in the chair she had occupied every evening that weather allowed, with the ridge above her and the cabin behind her, and her husband's hand over hers on the arm of the chair. Below the property, the creek said what it always said, the low, continuous conversation of water over stone that had been happening in this hollow since long before the cabin existed and would continue long after both of them were gone. Above the timber, the stars did their ancient, indifferent work. She thought about the drive from Millhaven, the November dark, Walter asleep in the passenger seat, the highway opening ahead of her, straight and empty, Millhaven falling away behind her in the dark she was not looking back into. She thought about the decision made in a parking lot on a Sunday morning in the cold after 47 years of attendance at a church that had finally said clearly what it had been communicating by degrees for over a year. She thought about the pump producing brown water and then clear, about the stove drawing on the third night, about 11 days in February, about the notebook filling on the kitchen table, about a reporter named Lena Cross sitting at that same table asking the question that required her to say out loud, for the first time, what she had understood in the parking lot, that staying to contest a verdict was a form of diminishment she was not going to accept. She thought about Owen Birch and the couple from Columbus, and the retired engineer from Cleveland, and the widow from North Carolina, and all the people who had sat on this porch across a summer and a fall and told her the thing underneath the specific words they were using. She thought about Nora's voice dropping below the level of the prepared speech. Everett splitting wood for 3 hours on a Saturday's afternoon. Willa at dawn on the porch saying you look like yourself. She thought about Glenn Marsh driving 4 hours to sit in a chair and say the actual thing. She thought about all of it and found that it did not feel like a completed story so much as it felt like a life which was not the same thing and was better. Stories have conclusions. Lives simply continue each day, adding itself to the one before it. The accumulation of ordinary mornings and practical work and conversations on the porch and the sound of the creek and the light through the east window, laying its stripe of pale gold across the table where the coffee was getting cold. The most important thing she had learned on this ridge was the simplest. She had spent 50 years in Millhaven doing her work and feeding her family and sustaining her marriage and building something real and useful, And she had done all of it while being in some fundamental way the size the town needed rather than the size she actually was. She had not known this. She had been too close to it to see it, and the town had been too close to care. It had taken losing everything to create the distance necessary to see the shape of what had been. The ridge had given her back the thing she had not known was missing. Not Millhaven, not the store, not the house on Wren Street, not the standing she had earned across 40 years. Herself, at her actual dimensions, without performance, without the continuous management of the gap between what was real and what needed to appear real, without the version of Margaret Holt that Millhaven had required. Just this, the cold and the creek and the work and the porch and the stars above the ridge and her husband's hand on hers and the morning that would come through the east window with its stripe of pale gold and ask nothing of her but that she be present in it and do the work it contained and be exactly who she was. She had driven toward this before dawn on a Tuesday in November, while the town she had served for 40 years was still asleep and had not yet noticed she was gone. It had cost her nothing she had not already lost, and it had returned everything that mattered.